Good morning, Commissioner Cardenas. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Mr. Chair, now that I have found my unmute button.
Excellent. All right. Well, we will then go ahead and proceed to get going. This is our Law and Policy Committee meeting. Today is January 13th, 2021. Ms. Lincoln, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Cardenas?
I'm here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Item number 1, our public comment for items not on the agenda. Do we have any public comment for items not on today's Law and Policy Committee meeting agenda? Hearing and seeing none. We'll proceed to item number 2, approval of the December 9th, 2020 Law and Policy Committee meeting minutes. Commissioner Cardenas, did you have any edits or suggestions, comments to those meeting minutes?
I do not, Mr. Chair. If you're ready, I'll move it.
Please proceed. All right, so I think we have a motion from Commissioner Cardenas.
Yes, I'm moving that.
Thank you. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
All right, proceeding to item number 3. This item is interested person feedback on our pre-noticed amendments to regulations governing the Enforcement Division's streamline and warning letter programs and a new Tier 2 streamline program. This was pre-noticed, excuse me, back in July of 2020. We've had several meetings both in law and policy and at the commission meeting, commission level regarding this item. We approved this item for presentation as is to the full commission this month. We did that in December, but to afford additional public participation, we're allowing for more feedback here today. So Ms. West, I see that you're here with us. Ms. Brereton, good morning. Would either of you care to offer any comments before we open it up to public comment?
I think you summarized it all. We received the comments from California Clean Money last night, and so we've had a brief opportunity to review those, and so we're prepared to discuss those today.
Thank you. Commissioner Cardenas, did you have any questions or comments for staff before we open it up to public comment?
Mr. Chair, in reviewing the CCMC letter, I'm wondering if it might be helpful to us. I think it would be to me if the presentation could be clear as to which of the 6, I believe it's 6 itemized points Mr. Lang raises in his letter, just so I can kind of check off my list of concerns. Is that agreeable? Is that easily doable?
Yes. When we talk about them, I talk about them by the number, and then a couple of them are combined because they're very overlapping topics. So I'll identify them.
Yep. That would be great. Thank you. Very helpful to me. Thank you.
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and open it up to public comment? I understand that Mr. Lang will be calling in. I also, consistent with our ex parte communication policy, I do want to disclose that I did have a phone conversation with Mr. Lang about this item. So that disclosure having been made, do we have any public comment on this item? All right, it appears we have nobody on the phone line at the moment. So, hold on. Did somebody just join? All right, hold on. Hello?
Hello, this is Trent Lang, California Clean Money Campaign.
Welcome, Mr. Lang. We are on item number 3. You're just in time.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, sir.
Oh, to have me talk about my letter. Okay, great. Thank you, Chair and Commissioner Cardenas and everybody else. First, thanks to the Commission and the staff for all your hard work on these improvements to the streamlining regulations. We know they're very important to make it easier for everybody and capture more of the things that could be given more simplified penalties. We did have a number of areas all related to the California Disclose Act, which of course we sponsored, that we wanted to raise that are concerns in the current draft, and we had some requests for amendments for those. The biggest concern, of course, the whole point of the California Disclose Act campaign, as many remember, took 7 years to the legislature, was really the clear disclosure of the top contributors of $50,000 or more. There are a couple changes to the streamlining proposed that we'd like to see to address that. If you have, do you guys all have my letter? So I'll just maybe quickly touch through the seven items quickly.
Yeah, if you could refer to them each one separately by number for ease of reference, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. So the number one and top thing is we don't believe that any advertisements missing top contributors should really ever be eligible for streamlining. To us, this is one of the biggest violations of the whole act, and certainly of the California Disclose Act. It is a major harm to the voting public when advertisements go out that do not show their top one or more of their top contributors of $2,000, of $50,000 or more. We appreciate the change in the current staff to say in the current version to say that in Tier 1 only ads that have an incorrect top contributor would be eligible for Tier 1 streamlining. That is appropriate because maybe they have their correct advertisers but the wrong name, or or the wrong initials or whatever. That's fine. But as written, it would allow ads with one entirely missing contributor in Tier 2. We don't think that's appropriate for the Disclose Act. So we would request that you would add that same incorrect only to the Tier 2 definition exclusion there. Related to this, and this is just as big, probably even bigger, it's that every other type of streamlining rule in these regulations, I believe, has thresholds based off of dollar amount. And in the case of contribution reports and late contribution reports and contributions, they're based off of population. So in a small city, you're proposing that anything above $16,700 would not be eligible for streamlining for late contribution reports, up to a maximum of $100,000 for statewide campaigns or Tier 2. I think that's very appropriate for late contributions, missing contributions, and of course the lobbying numbers, et cetera. But don't seem to, unless I'm wrong, there don't seem to be any similar maximum limit for violations of advertising and mass mailing disclosures. So somebody could have a $5 million advertising campaign and still be allowed into streamlining. So we would hope that you would put the same dollar threshold limits for advertising mass mailing disclosure violations as you do for contribution limits and late contribution reports, including the based off of population, because a $20,000 independent expenditure isn't going to be meaningful statewide, but it could mean a lot in a small city. That is one of the absolute most important things of all these. Number 3 is more of a clarification request. Maybe it's already defined someplace else, But to me, the word incorrect was a little bit confusing. Does that mean somebody that, for instance, uses initials instead of a name, like IBM instead of International Business Machines? That would make sense, and that would, any ads like that that have a top contributor that are incorrect because of that, or they put the parent instead of subsidiary, but it's fundamentally the right contributor, that totally makes sense, should be in streamlining, both either tier 1 or tier 2. But if it's incorrect and that it's the wrong one, which incorrect could mean, at least to a layperson, as in they put down IBM, but it was actually Microsoft or some person or some union or whatever, that would be, that to me is just as bad as it being missing, if not worse in some way. So hopefully there's some way of clarifying that if that's not already clarified. Item number 4, also on the top contributors, there is appropriate language in both tier 1 and tier 2 that specify the disclosure that fails to meet sizing requirements to the extent disclosure is not legible to the average viewer is considered a missing or incorrect disclosure. That's very appropriate. What we'd like to suggest is that if a top contributor is not legible to the average viewer, that should be considered missing, because if they can't read it, they can't maybe even see that it's there in many cases, but they can't clearly legibly read it, then that's as good as it being missing. So we would ask that you consider illegible top contributors to be missing, and then that would apply to number 1 with the incorrect only question. Number 5 is about late contribution reports and late contributions. Regarding top contributors, the current regulation for Tier 1, page 6, lines 13 to 15, recognizes the importance of late contribution reports where the contributions that were not reported might have affected one of the top contributors of $50,000 or more, by purposely excluding from Tier 1 any late campaign statements or reports from Tier 1 streamlining if the timely reporting of the contribution would have resulted in a change to the disclosure of the committee's top contributors. Because being able to verify on the Secretary of State website is an important way of verifying whether or not the top contributors shown on ads are accurate or up to date, we would ask that same exclusion used for Tier 1 that's already in Tier 1 for late contribution reports apply to Tier 2 for late contribution reports, and also to the late contributions. Again, only if they affect the top. We're only asking for the cases where they actually affect the top contributors of $50,000 or more. And then only 2 more. 6, repeat violators. The current Tier 1 regulations very appropriately exclude cases from Tier 1 streamlining if the same candidate, committee, or principal officer has paid a prior penalty to the Commission for the same type of violation occurring within the last 5 years. Obviously, we are very sympathetic to how complex these rules are, and if somebody doesn't know the rules, they're unsophisticated, they make a mistake, then streamlining is perfectly 100% appropriate. But if they're a repeat offender, if they make the same violation, especially within 5 years, as in the case of the current Tier 1 regulation, it doesn't seem like they should be eligible for a streamlining or for a low fine. So we would request that you put that same exclusion for Tier 2 also, again, for repeat violators of the same type of violation as is currently in Tier 1. And then the last is the percentage penalties question. The Tier 2 violations, obviously they are generally more serious violations than Tier 1, and potentially much larger violations. So they appropriately increase the base penalty a doubling of, from 200 to 400, tripling or quadrupling, and actually in the case for unreported contributions, increasing the base from $100 to $600. But as drafted, they leave the percentage part of the penalty at the same 1% as for Tier 1. Because these are much more serious and larger violations of generally more sophisticated violators in the type that would qualify under Tier 1 in most cases, we would request that the percentage fine be increased the same way the base fine is. So we suggested in the comment letter, make it 3 times, the base be 3 times and the penalty be 3 times. It could be 2 times, or it could even be something where the percentage is a range between 1 and say 4% at the discretion of enforcement, depending upon the seriousness of it, something like that. But we definitely feel it should be greater percentage penalties. So larger violators who fail to report $100,000 in lobbying activity or contributions don't get what many people on only a $1,400 contribution report, which I think a lot of the public would be kind of appalled at that. So that's the summary of it, and happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lang. Ms. West, do you or Ms. Brereton wish to respond to Mr. Lang's comments?
Sure, we can go through them.
I think that would be,
no specific questions.
helpful.
Okay, so as Mr. Lang was talking about, 1, 3, and 4 are kind of the same vein. We're talking about the missing top contributors. First of all, the principle that they should never be included in Streamline. And in talking to enforcement and through my own experience, we're not necessarily against that, because when we were trying to limit it to the incorrect kind of idea, then we were in support of, if the top contributor itself is missing, then it's not going to qualify for Streamline. So that's something that we are open to. And I think that the comments in 1, 3, and 4 really just pinpoint that we use the word incorrect twice with 2 different meanings. And so I think that the actual solution that kind of gets to what we're all talking about is to replace it when we're talking about just top contributors. So we use it in the term when we're talking about if something is too small to be legible, so it would fall into the category. So we used it to clarify. So when you read the reg, then you know if the type is too small to read, then we consider that to be incorrect or missing. So that was used to try to clarify another issue that we had run into, where if something was too small, well, did that actually qualify for Streamline, or is that a different criteria? So that was a different issue, and that's why we used that language to clarify what missing or incorrect meant. And then in this case, we used incorrect to try to qualify from Mr. Lang's first comments about not including top contributors unless they're just incorrect. And I think that was my mistake. I don't think I should have used that word incorrect again. So what we're thinking is something more substantially comply or identifiable. So what we're trying to say is that the top contributor information was there, like his IBM example, but it wasn't correct in the sense that all the words weren't in the right order, or say the committee name is Save the Puppies and it said Save the Puppies 2020 or something like that. So that's really what we're trying to get to, is the sense that you understand the information well enough and it's there, it's not missing. So I think that we're all in agreement that we can change the term to when we're saying incorrect only and add it to both regs to where we clarify that we're talking about substantially comply. So that's for the 1, 3, and 4 is kind of what we're talking about there. Does that make sense?
Well, let me just make sure I'm following what you just said. So if there is an advertisement that completely omits a top contributor that should have been listed in the disclaimer, does that qualify for streamline at all under what you just articulated?
It won't. And I think where the confusion for staff was coming was sometimes you'll run into a case, and as we know with digital ads, that these change daily. So you'll run into a case where the digital ad was incorrect for 1 or 2 days, and then they corrected it before the election, before being reached out to enforcement. And so they're like, well, could those qualify for streamline? Because those are where they self-corrected before the election, and it was a component that was missing for a few days. And that's the only, caution to saying top contributor would never qualify for streamline. But if we've looked at it, and we don't really think that there's a way to address a temporal component to get to all these scenarios. So instead of that, there is the discretion of the enforcement chief. And I think that's actually the answer to most of these questions is, why don't we have this other safeguard? And why don't we have this other, safety net? And the answer is we do. We put in the discretion for the enforcement chief into this version of the regs that we didn't have before. And we've actually beefed up the things that she has to consider in order to make sure that if this is intentional behavior, it's automatically excluded. But that's the long answer to your question. So the answer is yes, we would exclude from streamline if a top contributor was not present on the ad.
Okay, now that's very clear. I appreciate that, but now I'm going to probably make it less clear because you just used an example where for a period of time on a digital ad, the top contributor perhaps wasn't listed at all. And then they subsequently self-corrected. So under that scenario, for a period of time, there was a missing contributor. Are you saying that that is eligible for streamline because they self-correct, or are you saying that that's not eligible for streamline? That's the part I don't understand yet.
Yeah, I know. And that's the confusing part. What I'm saying is the exclusion would be there, but the new discretion for the enforcement chief would be a totality of circumstances, that she would be able to look at it and say, yes, this falls under the exclusion, but it's not the spirit of this exclusion. They self-corrected before the election and it was only wrong for 24 hours or 48 hours. And she can make that determination. And I think Mr. Lang actually touches on that when he talks about the penalties and maybe making that more discretionary. I think by us making it more discretionary to have these absolutes without trying to carve them out to every situation, to where she can do a totality of circumstances analysis is really what's going to make the streamlined program the most efficient and fair that it could be.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So that is certainly responsive to the concerns, I think, in items 1, 2, and at least in part 3, in my mind. Commissioner Cardenas, did you have additional comments on that?
No, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, so that gets us through 1, 3, and 4. So then number 2 is the population thresholds. So we had considered this when we first looked at, I mean, you can only imagine how many iterations this reg has gone through trying to address all the situations and listen to everybody's concerns. And so when we put other thresholds into the original regs, we didn't put it for advertising. And the reason for that was because the cost of advertisements are generally very low unless it's television. And so we didn't find a need to do that. However, that said, if this is something that the commission thinks would be helpful, it's information that we're gathering in order to do the percentage penalties anyway. So we do gather it at some point just later rather than earlier. So it would just change where the workload is. But it is something that we could do in order for, say, capturing the smaller committees that do television ads in a local jurisdiction. However, I remind you, there are other exclusions for intentional behavior, for the totality of the circumstances that the chief of enforcement would already be taking in consideration that would capture this type of activity. If you have a small committee that perhaps didn't file anything before the election, ran ads without any disclosure, you already have the exclusion from let's see, violations that cause confusion of, and we have that whole list of who the candidate committee identity is responsible, the top contributor, the sponsor, who they support, whether or not it's an independent expenditure. So we already have those blatant exclusions. So this could be an extra safety net. I personally don't see it as necessary just because you already have these other safety nets that we already put in place when we considered doing a threshold. But it is something that we could look into, and we could easily incorporate a population threshold, perhaps to Mr. Lang's suggestion of the amount of the ad.
All right. Can I ask a clarifying question on point number 2?
Sure.
Point number 2 in Mr. Lang's letter refers to violations of the advertising and disclosure requirements, right? So if something was incorrect there, that's what we're talking about. And presumably that would include the sizing requirements to those disclaimers, right? So there's I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to point out, there's some crossover between number 2 and number 4, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, okay. And under number 2, I think Mr. Lang has proposed that we have population thresholds which would act as an exclusion for disclosures that are not clearly written. Essentially not clearly written. Is that how you understand it too, Ms. West?
Yes. He
All right.
would propose it. Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So, but what we already know is that under number 4, we are going to exclude disclaimers that are so small, essentially, in terms of the sizing requirements, that they're not legible to voters, right? So those are already going to be excluded in response. So number 2 is taken care of in that sense. What about, instead of using strict population thresholds, currently under the streamline rules, the confusion standard, so if something is confusing, it's excluded, that applies to tier 1, right? It doesn't apply to tier 2. And this also gets later on to the question about discretion and tier 2 penalties. So if it's not automatically excluded from tier 2, if it's confusing, what would you think about giving some additional discretion to the chief of enforcement to exceed the base penalties articulated in tier 2 in circumstances where something, in this case, where a disclosure is confusing, is deemed to be confusing by the chief of enforcement? So you essentially give it additional penalties for these types of violations. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think that's interesting. I think that the only time we wouldn't, I think if it's discretion, it would be fine. I think that the new exclusion in tier 2 about the lack of committee formation in less than 25,000, that was to address the commission's issue with some of those independent expenditure committee cases that we had last year, where they were small. They didn't even really understand that they qualified as a committee. It was a person making speech, becoming an independent expenditure committee. So if it's discretion, I think we still wouldn't run into messing with those falling out of tier 2 or having enhanced penalties. But I do think that that's a good solution for this confusion element.
Yeah, and I think, what I'm struggling with is I think many of Mr. Lang's concerns, I think, are animated by his perspective that the campaigns and the committees that would be disclosing, subject to the disclosure requirements for top contributors, tend to be some of the largest committees with the most activity. So I think, on the one hand, we typically want to hold sophisticated actors to a higher standard than first-time candidates, less sophisticated actors. By the same token, I think to your point, Ms. West, there are some IE committees that this may be their first time participating, and they may make a mistake, and we don't necessarily want to right out the gate hit them with a maximum. And so I guess what I'm trying to do with my thought here is how do we balance those competing considerations? So that's why giving additional discretion to the chief of enforcement to my mind, may be a way to harmonize those concerns.
Yeah, and I think that addressed the penalty increase in number 7. Because my issue with number 7 and enforcement's issue with number 7 really was about the penalties being increased so much to where advertisements and other penalties in Streamline are much higher than Mainline. And so then what's the incentive for any respondent to participate in Streamline? And I think it would kind of cause a backfire for what we're trying to do here. Because then you have not only getting up to max penalty for some of these violations once you start doing the percentages too high, you also have Streamline is generally charged with all of the violations included, with some exceptions. And so Mainline is generally grouped. So you have a big difference in what the outcome would be if we start increasing the penalties. But if you do it as a discretion, when you find these certain factors like confusion, then I think that could work.
Okay. All right. I want to pause. Commissioner Cardenas, do you have any comments or responses to the conversation we were having on point number 2 in Mr. Lang's letter?
No, not specifically. I have some general impressions, but perhaps that can be deferred to another point in the discussion this morning.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. Ms. West, do you want to go ahead and continue down the list then?
Right. I think that brings us to number 5. So number 5 was a negotiated part of the Streamline the first time. And it basically just says you should be excluded if late contributions that you received and the report itself is filed more than 5 days late, and that information would have changed your top contributor. So I definitely propose rewriting it to make it a little more clear and to make sure that we understand that late contributor reports don't trigger the top contributor being changed itself. It's the information. So as Mr. Lang was pointing out, it's the information becoming public is when people generally know that a change was needed. So I think we do need to tweak that language to be clear. Now, as to if it should be excluded from tier 2, in talking to enforcement in my own experience, we've never used this exclusion. So it's not something that would come up that would impact workload. We could include it in tier 2 without it becoming a burden. It's generally just the commission's preference on this one.
Okay, so what we're talking about is adding this as an exclusion from tier 2, similar to tier 1, and the impact of that from your perspective would be minimal on staff. This wouldn't be contrary to the whole point of Streamline, which is to route more things through Streamline to the extent possible, conserving our resources to the most sophisticated large harm cases.
Right.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Cardenas, thoughts on number 5?
No, sir.
All right, Ms. West,
All right.
please continue.
So number 6, we disagreed the first time and the second time that we've written Streamline. So we, no surprise, enforcement and myself, we disagree with the conclusion of not including in tier 2 people that have had violations within the last 5 years. And I definitely feel strongly about not including warning letters as a prior, because a warning letter can be issued for all sorts of reasons, including your evidence isn't strong enough to go to hearing, and other reasons that you would get a warning letter as opposed to a Streamline or a Mainline fine. So I do think those should be off the table to start the conversation. But the reason that enforcement feels so strongly about the 5-year prohibition not included in tier 2 is because, as Mr. Lang said, the advertising rules are complex. And so you could actually violate a rule in the advertising section and it just be, it didn't say paid for by instead of ad paid for by. And if you look at what the conditions are for tier 1, you basically can contain two or more of your missing and correct number, your font size can be wrong. And then your committee name could have been, you could have shortened it and you could get a tier 1 violation. And then 5 years later, you don't comply with a new rule, which now is ad paid for by, and then anything else that has changed or come up. So then you make a different mistake under the advertising rules, and then you'll be excluded from tier 1 and tier 2 and have to get a mainline penalty for something that would qualify you for a tier 1 penalty, which I don't think is the good use of the commission's time. Again, there are enough safeguards in place that if there's evidence of intent to where they're intentionally violating the rules, or if the second violation is very egregious, there's going to be many opportunities for it not to be included in Streamline. And the chief of enforcement is going to see all of those and know that, hey, it's noted this has a prior, it's by the treasurer, or it's by the principal officer that was a volunteer 5 years ago. And so I think the expectation of knowing the rules based on making a mistake 5 years ago or 4 years ago, I think is not really, election cycles are 4 years apart generally. So I just don't think that expectation is realistic for people that don't do this as a profession.
So can I ask a question about the hypothetical you just gave, Ms. West, where
Sure.
In year 1, somebody violates the then existing advertisement disclosure rules. The rules change, and then 5 years down the line, they make another mistake. I mean, looking at the language, and now I realize I'm parsing this as a lawyer, but it does say the repeat violation exclusion occurs for the same type of violation. I mean, technically, if you violated one rule in year 1, but it was a different new rule in year 5, I mean, is that really considered by us to be the same violation? I mean, wouldn't you have to violate actually the exact same rule in order to trigger this?
It doesn't say exact same rule. I mean, if we wrote it as exact same rule, I probably would have more sympathy about it not being included. However, it's the same type of rule, which we generally consider as the category. So it's the same advertising category. And so we could tighten it to say the same violation, the same section, the same, activity. And maybe that is a compromise we could explore. But I think that the general sentiment in how it's written is in order to be able to let people make minor mistakes and get minor violation penalties for those mistakes. I mean, that's basically what we're trying to promote, is if it's still a minor violation, it should still get a streamlined penalty.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. Another approach, I suppose, would be to add this, hypothetically speaking, if we were to grant additional discretion to the chief of enforcement for tier 2 penalties, repeat violations of the same type could, in the discretion of the enforcement chief, be subject to higher penalties than the base in tier 2, which would allow the chief of enforcement to punish and deter those who are gaming the rules, even if they're making repeat minor violations, as opposed to coming down hard on those who truly, following our investigation, have just made a simple error. Would that be a possible compromise?
We could add more discretion in the 18360.2, the penalties sections, where we could put in a sentence of a caveat that would deal with the earlier discretion as well as this, in order to address, to give the enforcement chief the penalty to increase the percentages or the base amount.
Okay. Commissioner Cardenas, thoughts or comments on item number 6?
Specifically, no, Mr. Chair.
All right, great. All right, number 7, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but Ms. West, did you have anything else on number 7 you wanted to address?
No, basically it's my earlier point that if we tie ourselves to increased percentages. We've run the numbers. We didn't just propose these numbers out of the blue. So we took cases that have been on the agenda and other cases, and we've run these numbers, and these seem like the penalties that were appropriate for those cases according to the commission's guidelines. So these aren't necessarily just numbers we pulled out of the hat. So in the presentation that I gave many examples of what the penalty would be under the program and under the commission action. So we don't support changing them just to increase the penalties.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. West. Commissioner Cardenas, I know you have, I think you indicated you had some concerns. You wanted to wait till the end. You want to go ahead and take a minute?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thanks. Thanks very much. This is obviously not an easy discussion. First of all, just functionally tracking the discussion and the logic and the reason, because these are first of all quantitatively issues which are numerous, and then qualitatively many of these issues are rather ephemeral. They're a little hard to grasp. The only real way to understand almost epistemologically is to come up with examples, whether it's save the puppies or whatever other hinky example one might come up with. But part of what I think is involved here is we're trying to put our chief of enforcement in a empowered but also defensible position as she exercises what I think is going to be an incremental increase in the scope of her discretion in trying to determine in any particular case what appears to be going on based on the objective facts, but also, and I think this is crucial, what might be going on from my as a hypothetical chief of enforcement, from my experience, which is more subjective rather than objective. There are corollaries to this. For example, in the criminal law, when an investigator, a police officer, a detective, a prosecutor, a judge, a jury are trying to understand the mens rea of the actor. What based on the objective facts might have been the thinking, the intent of the sponsor, of the actor, of the committee. And so there are a lot of components and aspects to advertisements, both structurally and formalistically, the way that they are designed and put forward, but also structurally and operationally the way that they even come into being. What is the nature of the committee, the organization that has put this together? Is this a statewide experience, sophisticated, a sophisticated committee? And if so, then that's a factor in the mix. One of a theme I think that runs throughout our deliberations that we've had in the past, and also Mr. Lang's letter before us, is the concern that at least from time to time we have to be open to the possibility that there are those who would and do game the system, and so it's appropriate, even necessary, to take a totality of the circumstances approach when we're trying to understand what appears to be going on here and what might really be going on here. And so what we're talking about is further empowering our chief of enforcement to exercise her discretion based on her experience. But what I think what will help make her prosecution of her discretion and the commission's support support and critique of her work and findings moving forward, is that we're building a record here. We're building a legislative history of how we came to arrive at the factors in the mix and the different types of considerations that can and should go into these types of discussions, and that's why it is important to have these conversations in the open. Notwithstanding it needs to be done via Zoom, because at some point it may come to needing to prove that this was not an arbitrary or capricious exercise of administrative discretion, that this was an independent determination made by a chief of enforcement with considerable experience, who leaned into a long and complex and at sometimes torturous record of trying to understand what is the best balance of indicia and criteria to empower our staff with, and so I appreciate everything that Ms. West has just said. my final kind of broad, if not vague, commentary, Mr. Chair, is as a way of onboarding and ongoing edification for commissioners present and future. There are certain issues that we deal with as commissioners. It occurs to me as I near my tenure at some point in the near future, there's got to be some way for commissioners to be able to tap into, and I think the only way is by looking at transcripts and videos of prior commission meetings. There are certain issues, Mr. Chair, that really go to the heart of what we do and what we try to accomplish as stewards of the Political Reform Act, like determining the range and depth of discretion that our chief officer of enforcement should have, that commissioners should be attuned to, and so I'm almost thinking that we should, I suppose we can't compel, but we should strongly suggest that commissioners, almost like our annual ethics training, some way to encourage our commissioners with respect to certain issues like this one, to take it upon themselves to study what prior commissions have done to establish the record that our staff now operates from, because when they take certain actions, it's on the shoulders of a record that's been built in this type of a dialogue. And future commissioners would be better served as stewards of the PRA if they had a meaningful understanding of how we arrived at these particular determinations. A, because they can and ultimately, inevitably, will be challenged, and B, because it just helps commissioners be better commissioners for our staff and also for the public. And with that, as vague as they may have been, I will conclude my remarks, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. And to that last point that you made, I think one way that we've tried in the last year or two to create a better opportunity for commissioners to understand how enforcement operates and what the prior policy decisions are and what the open questions are, is to have, you may recall last year, the Enforcement Division present on its practices, its policies, and get direction. And I know Ms. Brereton is very much looking forward to doing a similar presentation to us in February. I think, Ms. Brereton, is when we talked about you doing that. So in the not too distant future, we'll be doing that. But I think that's, in my mind, to your point, Commissioner Cardenas, I think that's one way, not the only way, but certainly one way we can engage commissioners in what enforcement does and help educate them. That being said, by my count, we have, Mr. Lang identified 7 points in his letter. The conversation we just had, I think I have 4 potential amendments that we've talked about. So I want to just put those out there so that I'm clear, that we're all clear that these are the things we talked about, and then allow Mr. Lang an opportunity to chime in on this again. The first is to clarify that missing or incorrect top donor information is, in fact, an exclusion from Streamline. It sounded like there was some question about that at the outset. Ms. West, I think, was very strong in her statement that, in fact, that would be an exclusion from the Streamline program. So clarifying that. Number 2, defining what we mean by incorrect or missing. That is a term that we've used in a couple different places, and I think it's important that we define it so everybody is clear what exactly we mean in each context. Secondly, thirdly, to clarify that there is no Streamline eligibility for late contribution reports that would have changed the disclosure of top contributor information. I think I heard Ms. West say that that's something that enforcement agrees with. It should be excluded. So clarifying that in the regs is a third amendment. And then finally, with respect to Tier 2 penalties, at least from my perspective, I think we ought to consider amending the Tier 2 penalty section to allow the Chief of Enforcement to have the discretion to exceed the base penalties in Tier 2 for at least 2 different categories of violations. The first being missing or incorrect information and disclaimers. And then the second one would be folks who are repeat violators of the same type of violation. So under those 2 circumstances, the Chief of Enforcement would have the discretion to exceed the base penalties if she determined that that was appropriate under the circumstances. So that's what I have. That's my sense of what we just went through. Commissioner Cardenas, is that consistent with your understanding of the conversation we just had?
I believe your notes are better than mine, but yes, I agree that summarizes my takeaways.
Okay, excellent. Ms. West or Ms. Brereton, did either of you have comments on that, on the items I just read?
I had one.
Yeah.
For where the increased penalty was for missing incorrect disclaimer information, I thought that was for confusion in disclaimer information.
Well, I think it would be, you're right, it would be missing or incorrect information and disclaimers, which in the judgment of the Chief of Enforcement was likely to cause confusion for the voters.
Okay. And then for the defining incorrect or missing, my proposal was to change the second use of it, but do we still need a definition for the statement that we use where we say it's really just used as a qualification for the program? Let me get to the right language so I'm not speaking in the abstract. Hard because my Zoom is in my way. Hold on. All right, so the language is the advertisement. So I'm talking about Tier 2 right now, which is 18360.3. I'm on page 8. And I'm looking at eligibility requirements. So under line 11, subdivision C, we use it as the advertisement or mass mailing contains less than 4 missing or incorrect disclosures or display requirements in the disclaimer, and included is blah, blah, blah. And then later on line 16, we say a disclosure that fails to meet the sizing requirements to the extent the disclosure is not legible to the average viewer is considered missing or incorrect. So we use missing or incorrect in that terminology, and that was already in the Tier 1 as well under the first proposal as a all-inclusive term. We're trying to say it's missing or there's something wrong with it. And so we can change incorrect to it contains any errors or something like that, as opposed to defining it. But I think the confusion that was coming from is when we're saying that only one of the 4 can be a top contributor that was incorrect or missing. And that's where we were actually talking about it substantially complies as opposed to it was incorrect. So that's the one I was going to clarify on line 16 that was highlighted. So is it still the direction that we need to define incorrect, or is that adequate the way we're going to fix it?
Well, so the concern is, how do we define incorrect in the context of a top donor who, it was the IBM example, Microsoft versus IBM, right? So under our current program, how would that be treated?
So under our current program, IBM and International Business Machines would be considered just an incorrect disclosure. And so the top contributor would not be considered missing and it would qualify. Where, so the way we would change the language, it would be to clarify by saying only one of the four can be a top contributor, that the top contributor information substantially complied or was identifiable. So we would change it to where a top contributor would be excluded if it wasn't identifiable.
So sticking with our example, if somebody put IBM instead of Microsoft, is that identifiable or not?
No, because IBM and Microsoft are two different companies.
Okay. So how does that, I guess I'm just wondering, what is the value of changing that definition then for these purposes?
Right, and that's what I'm trying to say is that I agree with you that there's no value in changing how we're using it at the beginning, where it's for missing or incorrect, because we're using incorrect in its dictionary definition of wrong, which we could just change it to wrong if we wanted to. In fact, we looked it up in the dictionary, and the definition was wrong. Basically, the information was not factual, I believe it was. So in that context, it is the dictionary definition. What our mistake was using it again, but with a different context on line 15 and 16. So that's the one I would correct. To identify that top contributors are excluded if it's missing, and you can't identify who the top contributor is.
Okay. So if somebody misspelled the top contributor's name, but you could still tell who it was, that would not be an exclusion, is what you're saying, because it's still identifiable. But if the contributor was Microsoft and you wrote IBM, then that would be excluded, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That's what I would like to fix.
I now understand that, and I think that seems very sensible to me. Commissioner Cardenas, you you agree with that?
I do. Well, a simple misspell, like say one letter in the word Microsoft, for example, in and of itself would not be dispositive, but might it with other factors add to the complexion of the totality of circumstances?
Certainly. If we see that there's a pattern that they're doing things intentionally to mislead or confuse, then that's one of the exclusions.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Cardenas, anything further at this point before we go back to Mr. Lang on this?
No, sir.
All right, Ms. West, Ms. Brereton, anything further at this point? Okay, Mr. Lang, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
All right. I think you've heard our discussion. I feel, at least from my perspective, that we've have attempted to address some of the concerns that you've raised. Do you have additional thoughts, comments?
Yes, I agree. I'm very pleased, especially with the clarifications that missing contributors don't apply, and the clarifications around incorrect. That is all exactly what we were hoping for. A couple of quick other points on the same type of violations part, the repeat offenders. I think we had always been interpreted, I agree with Ms. West's concern that if somebody had, one disclosure violation for fonts and then 5 years later made a completely different type of disclosure, the background color or something else that was different, or even if the rules have changed, since the rules do change, guilty as charged sometimes, that shouldn't call into the repeat offenders list. So I would love to see that be narrowed to the same violation or something. So if you mess up on the same font size rule twice in 5 years in a row, that's a sign that, okay, you knew that rule and you're repeating it. So if you make that as a discretionary part to increasing the possible fines for tier 2, I mean, I understand that you don't always want to give increased fines in tier 2, and so that they're bigger than the mainlining fines. But I think it would concern a lot of people. It concerns me that there are some types of violations that seem like they would fall into tier 2 that are serious, like a failure to report $100,000 lobbying contribution, or $100,000 lobbying report, or $100,000 late contribution report, or $100,000 worth of advertisements that had various problems, though not top contributors, and only have a $1,400 fine in those cases. So if the solution was to say it's a minimum of 1%, but there's discretion to give a higher percentage, but in cases that fit into the streamlining for various reasons, but actually are more damaging to the public, that would be, I think, a very useful solution. And I appreciate everything else that you come up with to address these issues I've raised.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Lang. Is there anyone else on the line who wishes to make public comment on this item? This is item number 3. Hearing none. Ms. West or Ms. Brereton, do you have any final thoughts or comments for us on this?
I would just say I'm still a big fan of making these changes and really moving forward to the commission's direction of being able to free up staff time for the more serious violations. I'm glad we were able to come to some compromises and improve some language. And the discretion, I would think we'll take a stab at that language, and we'll limit it to the 2 things that Chair spoke about. And then we'll see if the discussion at the commission meeting takes it further as to Mr. Lang's comments about it being discretion for any of what he considers more serious violations. But as of now, I'll be writing it as directed.
All right. Well, before you start writing, I think we need to formally vote to accept the amendments we just talked about. Commissioner Cardenas, do you have any final thoughts? I'm prepared to make a motion, but I want to give you an opportunity to provide any thoughts that you had before so.
Well, that's great, because I'm prepared to second. But I do want to ask. I do want to ask Ms. Brereton if she has any comments as our new chief of enforcement. Might this be a situation where too much of a good thing can be too much of a good thing? I mean, are we investing a lot of discretion? Is this? Are you comfortable with this? You good to go?
I do feel comfortable with this. I would echo Ms. West's comments that I am looking forward to having a more robust program in place. I have an amazing staff. They know the rules backwards and forwards, and they are very good at what they do. And so I am confident that with their their good work and then my seeing everything coming across my desk, both of those in combination will lead to good results.
Thank you, Ms. Burton. You know, another thing that comes to mind is in the area of discretion. We're investing a lot in you, but that also compels. I think it should all of your staff to think in terms of, well, what are the factors that my chief of enforcement can take into account, because I get this sense when I look at many of the cases that come before us. Sometimes one gets the feeling, and looking at the fact pattern, that there was more to a particular case than might have initially met the eye, just based on objective criteria, but that at some point along the line, someone in your staff just had a tickle. In law school, we said, does it tickle your brain? If it is, then it's probative, right? And that's an opportunity for a member of your staff to say, should I dig a little deeper? Should I look at this more comprehensively? I need to examine what appear to be the objective facts in the context of what is my chief of enforcement going to be compelled? What lens is she compelled by her office to look at this? And because it's a slightly different paradigm as an investigative matter when you're looking at objective facts, as opposed to, okay, now what do all of these facts suggest to me potentially on a more subjective level, using my experience, but also understanding how the chief is compelled to look at this. Can you just speak for a moment, Ms. Brereton? Does your staff do they anticipate how you may be looking at this? Do our staff regularly have a look at this, not just through this is the objective prism, kind of a bright line, binary, right? Black, white, and do they also then shift to another lens by which they are allowing themselves to see the coloration of this, that it's not necessarily black and white, that there are gradations here which may be illuminated by a totality of the circumstances approach? That's the end of my question.
The short answer is yes. The enforcement staff, everyone from the political reform consultants to our support staff and analysts to our attorneys, everyone is very good about looking at all of the circumstances and making sure that I have all of the information that I need. And if they didn't anticipate something, they're very good at also looking back at things that I ask them to. If I am unclear on something, people are very open to obtaining the information that I need to make my final decisions. So they do anticipate most of the time, and they work with me when I have questions. So I get everything that I need ultimately in the end, sometimes a little faster than others, but everyone has their own unique perspective as well. And so sometimes my staff even think of things that I wouldn't have thought of to help me.
Yet another broad comment, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the indulgence. This latest iteration of our streamlining updating discussion really drives home for me. Our staff is everything, and the imperative and the premium that we place on retaining our staff and making sure that we are adequately resourcing our staff, and that we are smartly investing public dollars to keep our staff current and trained and fully satisfied with the experience of doing the people's business with the Political Reform Act. As the chair, I would just implore you to continue your support of our staff. Words have meaning, and I think your regular support of our staff has tremendous meaning. But also, where the rubber meets the road is with scarce dollars, and every meaningful, meritorious training opportunity that our staff can receive has got to be given consideration, and the head of our staff needs to be empowered to make a strong voice to the powers that be up there in the Capitol when it comes time to budget. That the people need our staff to remain expert. We've got to hold on to our staff where there are vacancies. We've got to continue to recruit the very best, and it's not just the touchy-feely stuff. It's the hard, tangible proof that on behalf of the people of the state, we value our staff and the work that they do, and they need to see it and feel it. Thank you very much.
Here. Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. All right. On item number 3, I would make a motion then that the Law and Policy Committee recommend to the full commission that the existing draft regulations for the Governing Enforcement Division Streamline Warning Letter programs and the new Tier 2 Streamline program be amended as follows. Number 1, to clarify that missing and incorrect top donor information is an exclusion from the Streamline program. Number 2, to define incorrect in Regulation 18360.3, to clarify that an incorrect name of a top contributor is not an exclusion so long as the identity of the top contributor is still readily ascertainable. So a simple typo is not going to result in an exclusion, for example. Number 3, that the Streamline program is not available for late contribution report violations that would have changed the disclosure of the top contributors on a disclosure or disclaimer, excuse me. And number 4, to amend the penalty section under Tier 2 of the new Streamline Tier 2 program to give additional discretion to the Chief of Enforcement to impose penalties higher than the base penalties in Tier 2, where 1, the missing or incorrect information on a disclaimer would result in confusion to voters, or 2, where there has been a repeat violation of the same type. Under those 2 circumstances, the Chief of Enforcement would have the authority to go above the base penalties in Tier 2. Commissioner Cardenas?
Second, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. West. Thank you, Ms. Brereton. Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. And thank you, Mr. Lang, for your comments and participation today. We appreciate it. All right, moving on to our next item, item number 4. We have our Legislative Counsel, Ms. Nakano, here to provide us with a legislative update. Good morning, Ms. Nakano.
Good morning. So the legislature reconvened this Monday, the 11th, which had been postponed by a week. And 6 commission-related bills have been introduced so far, 4 of which I verbally described at the last commission meeting and which are on today's report. The 5th bill was introduced yesterday, AB 227, introduced by Assemblymember Davies, and the SAC-B reported a 6th bill just after 10 a.m. today, though that bill has not yet been published on LegInfo. The 5th bill, AB 227, would prohibit a governor's appointee, a person residing in the appointee's household, or another person at the request or demand of the appointee from making a monetary contribution to the governor's campaign or to a committee organized to benefit the governor's campaign during the term of the appointment and for 1 year after the term expires. Additionally, the bill would require a prospective governor's appointee or a person residing in the prospective appointee's household who has made a monetary contribution to the governor's campaign or committee during a period of 1 year prior to the appointment to, upon notice of the intended appointment, immediately disclose that contribution to the governor. And the bill would prohibit the appointment unless the governor or the committee refunds that contribution. For purposes of the bill, governor's appointee is defined to mean an individual appointed by the governor to an office, board, commission, or other public entity. The 6th bill was reported by the SAC-B just after 10 a.m. today. As I mentioned, it's not yet available on LegInfo, and I have not yet received a copy. But according to the SAC-B, AB 236, introduced by Assemblymember Berman, would require limited liability companies to disclose the sources of funding, their sources of funding, if the LLC contributes $50,000 or more to a political campaign in the state in a given year, or a total of $100,000 in 4 consecutive years. The bill would require LLCs to identify funders and investors who contributed more than $1,000 to the LLC in a given year and whose monies were used in political donations. This bill is somewhat similar in theme to AB 2407, which Assemblymember Berman introduced last year, but which was not pursued due to COVID and related issues. AB 236 also appears at this point to be consistent with the Commission's approved legislative priority this year relating to LLC disclosure. There have been no substantive changes to the language of the other 4 bills, but as of Monday, AB 20 and AB 40 have been referred to the Assembly Elections Committee. I anticipate future amendments to these bills in the next couple of months, and I'll provide more detailed analysis once those bills are further developed. Committee chairs and membership have been set for the committees relevant to the Commission, and those are listed in the legislative report. Additionally, the tentative 2021 legislative calendar is attached to the report. Upcoming deadlines include January 22nd, which is the deadline to submit requests for language to the Office of Legislative Counsel in order to get that language back before the bill introduction deadline, which is February 19th. Staff will be submitting language requests to Leg Counsel consistent with what the Commission has approved so far, and I will be presenting, I believe, next month to the committee and the Commission on further developments to those proposals recommended by staff. Staff is continuing to talk to and approach potential authors. No updates on that at the moment, but I will keep the committee and the full Commission posted. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Nakano. So starting with the this morning's development that Assemblymember Berman has introduced a bill regarding the sources of LLCs. Based on your description, it sure sounds like that's consistent with the request we made of his office last year to carry a bill to disclose the sources of money that LLCs use in our state and local elections. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And then the 5th bill, the one you alluded to with Assemblymember Davies, I believe. Have you had an opportunity to talk to her office to understand what the underlying policy objective of that bill is?
No, not yet. I just heard about that bill this morning when it was published on LegInfo, so I haven't spoken with her office yet, but I will do that moving forward.
All right. I mean, in particular, I'm curious, and I think it'd be good information for the commission to have to understand whether there are similar limitations as what she is proposing on other statewide offices, and if not, what the rationale for just essentially targeting the governor's offices, and just what their policy rationale is with that. I think that would be helpful for the commission to understand as we move along here and ask to take a position on it, and also whether such a limitation on a person's ability to make contributions, which of course are protected by the First Amendment, would be subject to constitutional challenge or not. So I think at a future meeting, I'd appreciate being briefed on those issues. Commissioner Cardenas, any questions or comments on our ledge report?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I was looking for the this new Berman bill. I can't find it. I'm sorry, Ms. Nakano. What was what's the number? Was it 236?
It's AB 236, but it's not, at least last I checked, available on Ledge Info. It was reported by the SACB, which is where I received the bill number, but it appears the language has not yet been published.
Okay. So just based on what the Sacramento Bee is reporting this morning, it appears to be at least similar to last year's 2407 from Member Berman that we voted to support. Is that correct?
It's not identical, but it gets at the same disclosure goals. This one is more focused on the sources of funds, but it's consistent with what the commission voted on in September to support on disclosing the sources of funds for LLCs that make political donations.
How long might it be before, as you know, limited liability company regulation has been a keen interest of ours the last couple of years. How long might it be before we have actual language?
I believe the time to publish is less than a day. So if it's not available today, it should be available tomorrow morning.
Oh.
But I can also contact the office to see if a copy is available.
Ms. Nakano, we also, there was also Assembly Bill 2505, enhanced penalties for, was it personal use of campaign funds? Was that what 2505 was about last year?
I believe so, yes.
Have we heard any word about whether or not that or essentially something along those lines is being considered or might be introduced this time around?
I don't have any information on that yet, but I believe that's still a priority for the commission.
How much longer do members have to submit something for the new session?
The bill introduction deadline is February 19th. So that's the date by which they have to have either substantive language or a spot bill in as introduced language.
And you have a number of commission priorities on your desk that you are seeking to advance through various members. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And how are those discussions going, may I ask?
They're progressing. We don't have news on secured authors yet, but I will be reporting on that when we have more definitive news.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nakano. And just a minor clarification. You referenced a moment ago, and Commissioner Cardenas, you referenced that the commission had supported the bill to increase transparency with respect to LLCs. That's true. It's also true, though, that we actually proposed that as part of our affirmative legislative program last year. So we weren't simply supporting something that was brought to us. That was an idea that we affirmatively brought to the legislature's attention last year. So speaking for myself, I'm gratified that they are able to take that up this year, hopefully. So thank you, Ms. Nakano, for your work.
Ms. Nakano, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if I might. Ms. Nakano, when AB 236 has language, would you mind forwarding it, please?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you very much.
Moving to our last item, discussion of items for the February 2021 committee meeting. Clearly, a legislative update. I think Commissioner Cardenas is one item that we would want to have. At this point, I don't have other substantive policy ideas or concepts that we would be discussing at Law and Policy next month. Depending on our conversation next week at the full commission meeting, that may change. There may be things that are identified for further consideration at Law and Policy. But as of right now, all I have is the legislative agenda. Do you have anything that you wish to put on the February agenda at this time?
Well, I'm sure we're all going to miss the streamlining, unless it comes back.
Right. I feel very good about where the Streamline program is right now, but we'll see how it goes next week.
Oh, I think it's priced to move.
Yes. All right. All right. Well, anything further, Commissioner Cardenas, that you wish to talk about today, or do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'm good, Mr. Chair. Great meeting, solid staff work this month as always. And so with tremendous thanks, I move to adjourn, Mr. Chair, if that's your disposition.
It is, and I second that. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. Good seeing you. See you next week. And thank you to staff.